Did you ever want to restore the front suspension and steering on your MGB so that it looked like this? But were afraid that once you took it apart, you wouldn't be able to put it back together again. Stick around and find out how to reassemble the front suspension and steering on a 1972 MGB. Welcome to another episode of Maggie's Makeover, which is an epic automotive journey about the restoration of my 1972 MGB that hasn't run in over 40 years. Now, for those of you who saw our previous episode, you watched mechanic Steve bolt both the bump stops and spigots to the newly refurbished front suspension crossmember. You also saw him slide that underneath the car, jack it up, and bolt it to the frame of the car. Once that was complete, mechanic Steve installed the lever front shock absorbers, and he also bolted the pivot pins to the front suspension crossmember. Upon completion of that, mechanic Steve assembled the lower wishbone assemblies, including installing new poly bushings, and mounted those to the pivot pins. In this episode, mechanic Steve is going to install the swivel assemblies. He's going to attach the front steering control arms and install the rack and pinion system back into the car. He's also then going to install the torsion bar and connect it to the lower wishbones through the control links. In this episode, I'm also going to provide a cost update to you so you understand what we spent for this part of the restoration and where the restoration stands overall from a spend perspective. I think both you and my wife are going to find that pretty interesting. As usual, we love to get feedback from all of our viewers, and we love the fact that some of you actually smash those like buttons. So without further ado, let's head down to the shop and watch mechanic Steve finish the reassembly of Maggie's front suspension and steering components. Now that the pivot pin and the lower wishbone assembly are actually attached to the front suspension crossmember, it's time to install the swivel assemblies. Now, the top part of the swivel assembly is actually connected to the lever arm of the shock absorber, while the bottom part of the swivel assembly is actually connected to the wishbone. They're connected through a set of fulcrum pins, lock washers, castellated nuts, and split pins. Now, before these go into the car, they actually have to be prepped. So what do I mean by that? There's a set of the Super Pro poly bushings and a metal sleeve that have to be press fit into the top of the swivel assembly, while on the bottom end, there's a metal sleeve and grease seals that have to be assembled onto the lower half. Now, this swivel pin assembly is already completed and already prepped and ready to go in the car. The other one isn't, and that's a great opportunity to get up close and show you how we prepare the swivel assembly before it goes in the car. So the first thing we're going to do is take these Super Pro poly bushings that go on the top, and we're going to lubricate them with the special lubricant that comes with them. And then we're going to take that and we're going to just push it right in here into the top of the swivel assembly. We're going to do the same for the other one. And we also have to put some on the inside because it's going to be touching that metal sleeve. Now we're going to take this metal sleeve and we're going to slide it in here, press it in so it goes through. Actually, we don't even need to use the vise. Okay, so that's the top half that is completed and prepped. And now the bottom half involves the grease seals. So here's a grease seal that's already put together. I'll show you how that's done. First, there's the rubber component to it. And what you need to do, you can see there's a smaller ridge here, a larger ridge up on top. here is the metallic cap. There's two sides to this. You got to go in the right way with this. So they go like this, and they go on the inside of the upper end, the top larger side of the grease seal. Like that. Once that's in, we now take the washer, flip it over, push it in like that. The grease seal is ready to go. Now we're going to take this metal sleeve. As you remember, I had a really hard time getting the swivel assemblies off last time, and I think it had a lot to do with the fact that this metal sleeve was actually seized inside, rusted inside of the swivel assembly. So we're going to take this and we're going to apply some anti-seize grease to it and put that in. Okay, let's slide that in. All right, now the way the grease seals go on, you take the smaller profile, smaller diameter, metal cap on the outside, and just simply stretch it over the lower part of the swivel assembly. We'll do the same for this side. Sometimes these can be kind of finicky. No, but there we go. Okay, so this swivel assembly is now prepped and ready to be put into the car. So to install the swivel assembly in the car, we're first going to attach the lower trunnion to the wishbone. Once that's in, we're going to insert a coil spring into that spring pan, place a jack underneath the swivel assembly, and actually raise it up so we can then attach the top part to the lever of the shock absorber. So what does this have to do with the head of a BMW E30? Well, there's no engine in that car, so there's no weight. When I go to jack that up to compress that spring, it's actually going to lift it up off of the jack stands, which is what we don't want. So we're going to use this weight to counteract the compression of the spring. So let's see if my time at the gym and the muscles I've helped create allow me to do this. Okay, so that's in the car. Let's take those steps and get one of the swivel assemblies into the front suspension. Okay, so to attach the lower trunnion of the swivel assembly to the wishbone, I've actually loosened up the pivot pin and these bolts that hold the arm to the spring pan. That creates some distance in here so that this will be able to slide in. So we're simply going to lift this up, pinch the grease fittings together, slide that in, and now we're going to line this up and slide it through like that. Okay. And so now with that, we can tighten up the lower wishbone assembly. And so we'll go back and tighten these up to the proper torque and tighten this down, these down as well. And now the lower trunnion of the swivel assembly is now connected to the wishbone. Prior to installing the new coil springs into the front suspension, I thought it would be interesting to compare them to the older coil springs that came out of the car that are going to be replaced. This is the driver's side original spring that came out of Maggie, while this is the passenger side original spring that came out of Maggie. Now, if I line up the similar location of these springs, they are the same height. However, when I line up the similar locations of the new springs, they are actually 1/3 to 1/2 of a coil thickness shorter than the springs that were originally in the car. Now, I was assured by Moss Motors that these are the right springs to give me the original OEM ride height of the car. It'll be interesting to find out when this project is all said and done if we get that right ride height, given the difference of the heights of these springs. Okay, to attach the top trunnion of the swivel assembly into the shock absorber, the first thing we need to do is insert the coil spring. Now, I centered it on the spigot up above and then caught, there's a little lip in the spring pan on the inside, and I think that's there to kind of hold the spring as you start to bring this up. So we've got the spring, coil spring located in there, we've got a jack underneath there, and now we're gonna bring this up. And now what we have to do is actually spread that shock absorber. Now let's see if I can create some separation in here and slide this in. I want to keep my leg out of there. There we go. So now that's in, and now it's a matter of lining up the trunnion hole to the hole in the shock absorber. So we've lined this up now. I've got the fulcrum pin. I put some anti-seize grease on that. And now it's a matter of tapping this home, making sure that that flat edge is lined up with the flat edge of on the recess of the shock absorber arm. So that slides right in nice and neatly. I don't know if there's a lock washer or not. It didn't come with the kit, but this is the castellated nut that goes on the end here. Of course, there's a split pin to hold this. And so now that the swivel assembly is attached to the lower wishbone and the upper shock absorber lever, we are going to tighten up these spring pin bolts. There's two on the back, one in the front. The fourth connection point is the sway bar link. These are set to 28 foot-pounds of torque. So we're just going to grab this bolt in the back. There you go on that one. There's two. Let's get this one on the front. And that's that one. Now, and last of all, the fourth connection point of the spring pan to the arms of the lower wishbone is the sway bar link here. This is 60 foot-pounds per torque that we're going to torque this to. And there you go. So now all the connection points to the arms to the spring pan are fully torqued. Now we are going to nominally tighten these, the lower swivel assembly bolt and the lower fulcrum bolt and the top fulcrum bolt till about 25 foot-pounds. We're going to leave these loose. Again, we're just trying to create a rolling chassis here. I want to have the engine in the car before I tighten these so that we can establish the right ride height. So the next step is actually to install the steering rack assembly. But before we do that, we have to attach the steering control arms to the back of the spindle assembly, because this is where the tie rod ends of the steering rack actually get connected. They're held in by these two 5/8" bolts, and we're going to just get these started right here. And these actually get torqued down to between 60 and 65 foot-pounds of torque. We're going to go right in the middle at 62. There you go, 62 on that one. And 62 on that one. We're going to do the same on the other side, and then we're going to move on and install the steering rack assembly. So the steering rack gets installed by locating it on the mounting pads of the front suspension crossmember and bolting it down. Two types of bolts. These are the original ones that I evaporusted and cleaned up. There's a threaded one that goes on top, and then there's a one with a nut and a lock washer that actually goes on the bottom of these. Now the challenge is locating those holes on the steering rack, yet being able to connect it to the universal joint up there. So I found that the best way to do this is to actually grab the steering rack from up top, feed it down into the car. You may have a different way, but this way kind of worked for me. I think it's going to work. Roughly lining up the pads where the bolt is going to be. This goes underneath the motor mount. And then simply trying to line up the universal joint at the same time, and then pushing that forward and in like that. So getting these bolts to line up and actually the top ones to thread in while the steering rack is connected to the universal joint is not an easy task. What I found worked was to hold the rack above this connection point, and you have to really move the rack around to line up that hole the best you can, and then to get this threaded. And you got to be careful because you don't want to cross thread the connection into the cross member. So you got to do these with special care. Once you have those done, these just drop right in, and then we can actually tighten these down. And then go below and put the lock washers and nuts on the free ones. And now we're ready to actually torque these. I believe the torque specification on these is 30 foot-pounds. There you go, that's that one, 30. Let's go this one to 30. That's 30 on that one. $30 on that one, and now 30 on the remaining one down here. I don't think I've done this. And 30 on that. And now, the last thing we need to do is bolt this cinch bolt back together. I believe that's 22 foot-pounds. And so for some reason, I can't find this bolt here that goes in the universal joint. I'll have to order another one. So the rack is now mounted. The last thing we have to do, and it's connected to the steering wheel universal joint. Next thing we have to do is put the tie rod ends into the steering control arms. And so here's our control rod end. This is a 3/4 inch nut. We're going to take this off. You can see I put a little anti-seize on that tapered surface, and this just fits right down in the steering arm. Now you're going to notice this pops through, gives you enough thread here to put this bolt on. If you're doing this at home and you find out that this doesn't come all the way through, well, that's because you have your steering arms mixed up left to right on the car. How do I know this? Because I actually did this and had to take these off and swap them. There's a larger size opening on the top of the steering control arm than on the bottom to accommodate that tapered surface. So we're going to put this nut on and we're going to torque it down. The torque spec on this is 35 foot-pounds. And there we go, 35 foot-pounds of torque. And so this is now connected on this side. We're going to go do it over on the driver's side. And then after that, we're going to finish this job up by putting in the sway bar or torsion bar. So here's our refurbished sway bar. We actually sanded this down, primed it, and painted it. We also press fit in 2 new bushings on either end. That's not necessarily an easy job, but we did have a method to our madness. So first you have to remove the existing bushing that's in the torsion bar. We used a set of dissimilar socket sizes and a vise to try to drive that out. Unfortunately, the outer metal sleeve remained in the torsion bar. After several failed attempts to try to push that remaining metal sleeve out of the torsion bar, I actually had to resort to cutting it out, put it in a vise, and I used a hacksaw to carefully cut through that. Now when you do this, you have to be careful not to cut into the torsion bar itself. With that done, you simply take a screwdriver and deform that metal ring into a smaller diameter so you can actually remove it from the torsion bar. Installing the new bushing was actually pretty easy. We used a threaded rod, some washers, and some nuts, along with a wrench and a socket. We assembled those into the vise, applied some anti-seize grease onto the new bushing, tightened the nuts, and drove that new bushing into the torsion bar. So let me take you through some of the things that you're going to need to actually install this sway bar. They're shown right here in front of me. To actually attach the sway bar to the car, you're going to need these mounting brackets with the nuts and bolts that actually secure them to the car. And within each of these brackets are our Super Pro poly bushings, which the torsion bar fits through. Now we're going to use, much like we did before, we're going to use the lubricating grease on the inside and the outside perimeter of these brackets. In addition to that, you're going to need these locating hardware that clamp on either end of the torsion bar to actually hold it left to right within the car. And in addition to that, we have these 2 bolts that go through the bushings on either end of the torsion bar and connect to the control links that are attached to the wishbone. So that's the hardware and how it's actually used with the torsion bar. Let's get underneath the car and get this installed. So I'm sure there are many ways to do this. This is the way that I did it. It seemed to make sense for me. I'm first going to start by attaching the sway bar to the control links that go to the lower wishbone assembly and putting those bolts right through the bushings of the sway bar. This is going to allow the sway bar to kind of rotate like this, and we're going to rotate it up, and that's going to allow us to locate where roughly those bushings are going to go along with the brackets. And so here we are underneath the car. Let me just get you oriented. This is, of course, the sway bar. It can rotate up like that. These are the 2 frame rails where the poly bushings and the brackets are going to be attached. And we're simply going to slide this up here just to locate left to right where the bushing goes. I have a screwdriver that's going to use to spread this bushing, hopefully, from the inside to get it going. And then we're simply going to just press this on. There we go, it started. Let's just push that right up there like that. So that's going to go on like that. Now we're going to load up the outside of this with grease. Now that that's done, we're going to simply take the bracket with the bolts, push this over it like this, and then line this up and put the bolts in. And so these are 1/2 inch. So we're going to tighten these down somewhat tight, but not torqued, because we're going to go over to the other side and complete the same process over there. Okay, so now we can come back, tighten these down, snug them. And I'm sure there's a torque spec on this. but I can't get to my phone because I'm filming. I'll tell you at the end of that. All right, so now that those are both up, it's time to mount the locating hardware. Okay, and so the locating hardware is going to go with this ridge flange on the inside. I actually coated that with some of that lubricating grease because it is going to be touching the bushing. Here is the bottom, which is going to go like this. Okay, so that goes like that, and now we're going to screw these tight. I'm going to try to do it evenly. That's started. I'm going to come back to this and tighten these down and torque these down. So let's go to the other side and get that one done. All right. So that's how these are. The sway bar is mounted. Now what I'm going to go do is I will put the nut and bolt on the control, the link, sway bar link to the lower wishbone, and tighten everything down to the proper torque specifications. So the bolts that hold the sway bar bushing brackets are 3/8 fine thread. We've tightened those down to 30 foot-pounds of torque. The bolt that holds the sway bar to the control link is a 7/16 fine thread, so we're going to tighten that down to 50 foot-pounds of torque. And there we go, 50 foot-pounds of torque. And so the final piece of the suspension reassembly is to put the front hubs that we reconditioned back on the spindle. So we're going to do this by first taking off the cap, taking out the nut and the washer, and also removing the front bearing. Now we're going to take the collar. You notice the collar has a radius section that matches this radius section in there. And I'm just gonna put a little grease on here. Don't know if you need to do that, but I'm gonna do that. And on the outside here as well. And we're gonna take this and we're gonna put this back in the rear part where the oil seal is. So that goes in there like that. And now we're going to simply slide this onto the spindle. And that goes in like that. We're going to take the front bearing. I'm going to just put a little extra grease on here. I don't know. It's the races are filled with this when we use that that specialized tool, but I'm going to add just a little bit more on here. I'm going to pop that in like that. Now, so the bearing is dropped in. I'm going to put a little bit more grease in here. I don't know if you need to do that, but I don't know, can't hurt. Now we're going to put this washer on. That washer has a notch to it that gets fit in here like that. And now we're going to take the nut and we're going to put that on. You can see I've gotten grease everywhere. Given that Maggie is not going to be driven in the near term, but rather only put on a trailer and brought back and forth from the body shop, I'm not going to put any of the brake components on, nor am I going to tighten this spindle nut down to the appropriate torque and put the split pin in. I am, however, going to tighten this nut to a nominal amount so that the hub stays on yet spins freely, and that's right about there. Now we're going to put the Grease cap back on. And so that completes the reassembly of Maggie's front suspension and steering components. For those of you out there who are doing this work and are actually going to drive your car, don't forget to tighten down those fulcrum bolts on the swivel assembly. The top should be tightened to 40 foot-pounds of torque, while the bottom should be at 45, and don't forget to add those split pins. Similarly, on the wishbone, tighten those castellated nuts down to, I think it's 28 foot-pounds of torque, and add those split pins as well. And as far as the hub is concerned, don't forget to add those shims so that when you tighten down that spindle nut between 40 and 60 foot-pounds of torque, you get the right play in that hub. I think it's a couple of thousandths, yet the hub spins freely. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Studio Steve, for the episode wrap-up. Hey, thanks, Mechanic Steve. So now what did we spend to refurbish Maggie's front suspension and steering assemblies? Well, it came out to $2,500, which was a lot more than I anticipated. Now, these are parts that are going to be underneath the car that you're never going to see, but I'm glad I spent the money because I know they're going to function properly and the car will be safe. So let's take a look at the breakdown that comprises that $2,500. The two most expensive items on the list were the swivel assemblies, which came in at $560, followed by the cost to refurbish the front cross frame, which came in at $500. And who would have known I would have spent $285 on assorted nuts and bolts, which is more than the cost to rebuild the front lever shock absorbers, which came in at $220. Likewise, the bump stops, spigots, and pivot pins cost $169, which was more than the spring pans and coil springs, which came in at $164. Given that I purchased these parts over a year and a half ago, I'm afraid if you attempted to do this job in terms of today's dollars, it would probably cost you upwards of about $3,000. Now, if you're looking to take cost out of this part of the restoration, I would definitely have those swivel assemblies rebuilt. I would definitely rattle can that front suspension cross member as opposed to having it sent out and be painted. And yes, I would clean up all the existing nuts and bolts that are on the car and reuse them, as well as the pivot pins, bump stops, and spigots. So with that said, given the $2,500 that we did spend, the total cost of the restoration now stands at $10,408. So that's a wrap for this episode of Maggie's Makeover. You know, for those of you who are contemplating rebuilding your front suspension and steering, or perhaps for those of you who are partway through that job, we hope you found this content enjoyable and helpful. As always, make sure you leave us a comment and smash that like button on the video. Stay tuned for our next episode where we load Maggie on the trailer and take her body shop speed dating. Until then, happy motoring. Okay, yeah, mic test, 1, 2, that's it, let's go. That's good, all right, lighting, we got that, everything look okay, no shadows behind me. All right, hey, you know what? I'm just not in the mood to do these opening remarks for the episode. Can you just cue some of the music, opening episode music? Yeah, that's it. Turn it up, a little bit louder, that's it. Yep, I can start to feel the energy. It's starting to course through my body. I am so ready to do this episode. Let's go. So the camera's set up exactly like we want it. We have the lighting all set up. I'm all mic'd up. Where's the wireless equipment for the microphone? Oh my God, I left that at home. That means a 50-minute round trip to go get it. Don't go away, I'll be right back.